Welcome to the third module and lecture in this course on technology and the psyche. This module is entitled Alchemy, Technology of the Soul. The word alchemy is derived from the same Greek word chemeia that chemistry is derived from. That word itself, however, is rather mysterious. Some say it's a version of the Egyptian name for Egypt that God transported into Greek. In any event, both alchemy and chemistry are technologies or techne, and alchemy has been analyzed in great depth by depth psychologists, including Jung himself. Our first set of readings will come from this depth psychologist, Edward Edinger. Edinger was one of the most prominent Jungians of recent times. He was best known as heading the Jung Foundation in Los Angeles between 1979 and his death in 1998. And the book we're going to be reading a short portion of, Anatomy of the Psyche, is, in my opinion, the best introduction to a Jungian view of alchemy that's out there. I highly urge you to read the book as a whole if you have the time and the inclination. We'll be reading the introductory chapter in which Edinger says that alchemical processes describe the process of depth psychotherapy, which is identical with what Jung calls individuation. In other words, the technological processes of alchemy are the processes of individuation by means of which the soul is created or uncovered, whichever way you prefer to look at it. Edinger quotes from the Emerald Tablet, also known as the Tabula Smaragdina, one of the key alchemical texts by the gentleman in the middle, whom we met last week, Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary Hellenistic combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. The alchemical process is one in which, above all, requires patience. Another text that Edinger quotes says, "All ye seekers after this art, you can reach no useful result without a patient, laborious, and solicitous soul, persevering courage, and continuous regimen." In depth psychology, Edinger goes on to point out, patience is basic, and courage means a willingness to face anxiety. Edinger also stresses the paradoxical quality of both the alchemical and psychotherapeutic processes. He says an awareness of the self and the religious attitude that such an awareness brings are the goals of psychotherapy rather than requirements at the beginning. However, the potential at least must exist from the start. So paradoxically, one has to start out with what one is ostensibly looking for. And this is the sort of paradox that we found frequently invoked by the Hermetic trickster. On page 8, Edinger makes the statement that the alchemical opus or work was considered a process begun by nature but requiring the conscious art and effort of a human being to complete. This is a profound idea. In one sense, the opus is against nature, but in another sense, the alchemist is helping her to do what she cannot do for herself. This surely refers to the evolution of consciousness. To me, this quote quite neatly summarizes the nature of the interrelationship between technology and the psyche that we're exploring in this course. Edinger tells us that alchemical technology transforms and transmutes what's known as prima materia, or the prime matter, that which underlies all existence, the entire cosmos, including ourselves and our souls. Heraclitus here, who may be the most fascinating of the pre-Socratic philosophers, emphasized equally the underlying identity of this prima materia and its ever-changing, never the same nature. Edinger goes on to say that the prima materia is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, but we don't recognize it, it's unknown, at least for the most part, making it sound very much like what Mahayana Buddhists call the Buddha nature. Last encountered the Greek epic poet Hesiod, and in the Theogony, his creation myth poem, the prima materia is identified as chaos, that which out of which everything arises and to which it returns. In the remainder of this excellent book, Edinger goes into 7 of the alchemical operations or techniques or techni by means of which the prima materia is transmuted and transformed from one state into another. These include such processes as solutio, which means dissolving, coagulatio, precipitating something into solid matter, sublimatio, volatilizing something, making it into a gas, separatio, separating something, conjunctio, joining something together, mortificatio, killing something, and calcinatio, heating material so that it becomes a dry powder. Each of these alchemical operations has precise psychic, psychological analogs. Much of our reading this week will be from a book by this gentleman, Mircea Eliade, a Romanian born in 1907, best known, in fact, extremely well known as a historian and analyst of religion. After World War II, he moved to Paris and then in 1956 to Chicago and taught at the University of Chicago until his death. Very closely associated with the Eranos circle that formed around Jung and Jungian teachers and teachings. The book we'll be reading from is entitled The Forge and the Crucible, The Origins and Structures of Alchemy, and it was originally published in 1946 in French under the title Forgerons et Alchimistes, which means Smiths and Alchemists. One of the reasons I assign this book is that I find it fascinating and very convincing the way that Eliade connects the practices and technologies of metalworking or smithing and alchemy. Here's good old Hephaestus or Vulcan, the blacksmith or metalsmith, who's one of the Greco-Roman gods. And it seems very clear to me that metalsmithing is in fact a technology, in fact one of the most fundamental technologies invented by humans, probably right next to agriculture. Here is William Blake's painting of the Platonic demiurge. The demiurge is the worker or smith who is said to create the cosmos in Plato's late dialogue, the Timaeus. Eliade makes the point that both smiths and alchemists help to quicken nature, that is, artificially accelerate natural processes, make things happen faster, something we can well relate to in our digital age. And one thing that I find particularly interesting is this notion of speeding things up paradoxically juxtaposed in the way of Hermes the Trickster with what Edinger noted as the patience required for alchemical processes and soul making. Eliade relates both smithing and alchemy to shamanism, and he himself wrote one of the great books on the subject, Shamanism and the Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. And again, we have this notion of technique and technology. He stresses that smiths belonged to guilds that had initiatory secrets. Again, we have this notion of initiation, liminality, movement from one state into another, which is very characteristic of Hermes the Trickster. Smiths are also associated with art and specifically with epic poetry. This is a depiction of the shield of Achilles, whose forging by the god Hephaestus is described in a famous passage from Book 18 of Homer's Iliad. One of Hesiod's epic poems also centers around a shield, the shield of Heracles. Eliade Eliade then goes on to talk about the profoundly ambivalent or paradoxical attitudes toward smiths, metalworking, and even metals in various cultures. Among the Yoruba people, for instance, in Africa, the smith among the Yoruba was considered a culture hero or civilizing hero. Same among the Dogon people. Elsewhere in Africa, however, among the Maasai, the smith was considered unclean, someone to be shunned. Not only is this profound ambivalence characteristic of that which is Hermetic, but in many ways I feel it very much continues in our current attitudes toward technology. At least for myself, there's that combination of shunning and eager greeting. Before moving into an exploration of the medieval European alchemy that so fascinates both Jung and Edinger, Eliade explores the nature of alchemical thought and practice in such Asian societies as China and India. In China, alchemy is particularly associated with Taoist practice. In one form of Taoist meditation, Eliade tells us one returns to the primordial chaotic state, the prima materia, and one also transforms and transmutes this energy in the three internal vessels known as the three Tantien, in which Qi, the life force energy associated with the middle Tantien, is transmuted from Jing, the more liquid visceral energy in the lower Tantien, and then again transmuted into Shen, the more electric energy of consciousness and attention in the upper Tantien. Eliade then moves to the Indian subcontinent to deal with Indian alchemy. One of the first Indian figures he mentions as the writer of alchemical texts is Nagarjuna, who's pictured here. Nagarjuna is better known as the founder of the Madhyamaka school of Buddhism, which is really the origin of Mahayana Buddhism. And in fact, he's so important in the history of Buddhism that he's sometimes known as the second Buddha. Eliade then moves on to the alchemical aspects of the Samkhya system, the yogic philosophy that he wrote about at great length and in great depth in his book, Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom. Samkhya is a somewhat dualistic system in which Purusha, which is the real self, needs to be alchemically, as it were, separated from Prakriti, which means substance or matter, in order to achieve what's called a Jnana Deha, or body of gnosis, body of knowledge. We'll be looking at the Gnostic vision and its relationship to technology and the psyche in later modules. And the way that this is accomplished is through sadhana. Sadhana literally means a way or a means of accomplishing something. Specifically, it means any sort of spiritually transformative practice, such as meditation or physical hatha yoga. Sadhana is a technique or techne that facilitates and leads to spiritual growth. Eliade then speaks about what is now a better known yogic system, that of Patanjali, who's pictured here, the author of the Yoga Sutras. The first or second verse of the Yoga Sutras, the most famous verse, goes, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which basically means yoga, or the purpose of yoga, is to still or restrain the waverings, the modifications of the chitta, which is the heart-mind, leading the chitta alchemically, as it were, from that state of flux that we've talked about previously into its original stillness. At this point, Eliade begins to talk about the Western medieval and Renaissance forms of alchemy that we had previously looked at in the selection from Edinger's book. He talks about this gentleman, Paracelsus, the great Renaissance Swiss-German alchemist who lived from 1493 to 1541. Eliade made the particular point that, as with the metalsmiths, in order to become an alchemist, one had to undergo an initiation and join a guild. He takes us back to earlier cultural phases and speaks on page 144, saying what is especially important to emphasize is the possibility given to primitive man to immerse himself in the sacred by his own work as a homo faber and as a creator and manipulator of tools. Homo faber is a phrase that means man the maker, the user of tools, and Eliade again emphasizes how this aspect of humanity, the technological aspect, can serve also as a tool for exploring the sacred and developing the psyche. Eliade also emphasizes the importance for Western alchemy of the Hellenistic period, just before and after the life of Christ, and the what he calls the Greco-Egyptian schools of alchemy that developed here at Alexandria. There's a painting of Alexandria and its pharos, or lighthouse. He stresses how the magnum opus, or great alchemical work, is focused on transmutation, its relationship to the non-Christian and Christian forms of Gnosticism that arose at that time, the importance of the Christian imagery of the sacrificial death and transfiguration. This transfiguration first involves a dissolution, or in the words of one of my favorite alchemical sayings, for something to be transformed, it must first be dissolved completely. The magnum opus, or great work, is in fact a gnosis, which means a coming to knowledge or wisdom. And once again, we have the presence of paradox in the image of the Holy Marriage, Hieros Gamos, which is also a coincidentia oppositorum, that is the conjunction of opposites, and the equivalence between the term paradox and the term mystery. This joining of opposites is also known as the mysterium conjunctionis, the mystery of the co-joining of opposites. As alchemy enters its better known medieval and Renaissance European phase, one of its principal goals becomes the creation or finding of the so-called Philosopher's Stone. Here is the prop Philosopher's Stone used in the film Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which might be as good a representation as any. Eliade says, we should like to stress the paradoxical character of the beginning and the end of the opus alchemicum, that is the alchemical work. One starts with the materia prima in order ultimately to arrive at the Philosopher's Stone, but both substances defy precise identification. He then goes on to say, the alchemist's emergence on another spiritual plane with the aid of the Philosopher's Stone may be compared with the experience of the religious man, Homo religiosus, who assists in the transmutation of the cosmos by the revelation of the sacred. The paradox of the hierophany consists in the fact that it manifests the sacred and incarnates the transcendental in a base thing. In other words, it brings about a break in level. The same paradox is evident in the Philosopher's Stone. It is beyond the comprehension of the uninitiated, though children may play with it or servants throw it into the streets. Although it is everywhere, it is the most elusive of things. With this notion of the break-in level, we come again to hermetic liminality, the crisscrossing or chiasmus, the aporia, that is the blockage that suddenly opens up into a passageway, and the paradox we've already seen any number of times in association with the technology of soul creation. During the scientific revolution of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, alchemy itself transmuted into chemistry. Here we have our archetypal chemist Walter White from Breaking Bad, along with his sidekick Jesse. I was taught in school, as we probably all were, that alchemy was basically a primitive form of chemistry which developed out of it once the experimental method came into being with the scientific revolution. It's a little more complex than that. As Eliade said, alchemy has bequeathed much more to the modern world than a rudimentary chemistry. It has left us its faith in the transmutation of nature and its ambition to control time. However, although he put himself in the place of time, the alchemist took good care not to assume its role. His dream was to accelerate the tempo of things, to create more gold more quickly than nature. But like the good philosopher or mystic that he was afraid of time. However, with the scientific revolution, this circumspection ceased. Eliade says the tragic grandeur of modern man is bound up with the fact that he was the first to take on the work of time in relation to nature. Man in modern society has finally assumed the garb of time, not only in his relations with nature, but also in respect to himself. For the first time in his history, man assumed this very harsh task of doing better and quicker than nature, without now having at his disposal the liturgical dimension which in other societies made work bearable. We'll end on this somewhat somber note, and also let's leave ourselves with the open-ended question of whether pre-scientific technology and post-scientific technology are radically different in the sense, among others, that pre-scientific technology could be used in the service of the psyche, while scientific or post-scientific technology cannot. I think that's a very understandable conclusion, and on the other hand, it's almost certain that things, again, are a bit more complicated than that.